Hello, everyone. This is Ben Kelly with the Endeavoring Orthodoxy podcast. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe or give me a follow. And I'm going to try to give you content like this every week. Today, we are continuing reading our paper, White Jesus and Anti-Semitism Toward an Anti-Racist and Decolonial Christology by Paul Hedges. I started reading this last week. So if you haven't been through that episode yet, go back and listen to that first, or you're going to miss the first half of the paper. We only got about 40% of the way through the paper last week. And we're not going to read everything in the paper, but we're going to get started in a section of the paper called Christianity and Anti-Semitism, a survey and response. And so if you can't remember what I had been talking about a couple episodes ago, I talked about three main presuppositions that critical theory brings into theology when it's doing theology. Mainly that it kind of converges general revelation and special revelation and making experience more genuine and more just more attractive and even more authoritative than God's special revelation. So that's one presupposition. Another is a misunderstanding of the person of Christ, really not understanding Christ as God and Savior, but rather understanding Him as as Messiah, maybe as a prophet, someone who is there to be a good teacher and to produce an ethical life in people. And then the third presupposition is just a misunderstanding of humanity, the nature of man, and how the Bible really talks about man is depraved, man is sinful to his core, and he's not able to do anything to merit salvation for himself. Well, unfortunately, critical theory does not understand man like that. It understands only as some people being truly like that, where others are just victims, or they are the oppressed, and they are the victims of people who are exhibiting power schemes. And so I'm reading this paper to highlight how these presuppositions come about in this type of theology. And so we are kicking off about, again, 40% of the way through the paper under the headline Christianity and Anti-Semitism, a survey and response. So Dr. Hedges starts out around 2,000 years ago, around 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism blights our world. Even if not the cause, anti-Semitism cannot be denied as a key contributing factor in the Holocaust, Nazi Germany's attempt to obliterate Jewish populations under its dominion. Now, I think that's fair. There's definitely some truth to that. I don't know about the first sentence. Around 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism blights our world. That's a bit hyperbolic, if you will, but we'll go on. He continues, as such, it sits today as a strong marker in Jewish Christian relations. Christians have acknowledged this heritage and even have institutionally sought to make amends. And he says, certain theologians have written important tracts on this problem. An entire genre of post-Holocaust writings, especially in such areas as theodicy, have arisen. Under the aegis of the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church has altered its liturgy, placed Jewish Christian relations within ecumenical dialogue rather than interreligious relations, and acknowledged the church's involvement in the anti-Semitism which led to the Holocaust. Now, what's he saying there? What he's saying is that, yeah, some theologians and some people within the church have recognized historical anti-Semitism within the Christian church, and even the Roman Catholic Church under the Second Vatican Council, which happened. It was in the 1960s. I don't know the exact date on that. They really did a lot to repair Jewish Christian relations within ecumenical dialogue. Now, I am not a Roman Catholic, so I can't speak a lot to this, but I am pretty well versed in specifically the history of the doctrine of revelation. I do understand some major changes that took place in the Second Vatican Council and why many Roman Catholics today especially conservative ones, they do not approve of the Second Vatican Council. I actually have family members who are pretty committed Roman Catholics, and they do not approve of the Second Vatican Council. And so, what happened in Vatican II, one of the most interesting achievements of it was that they established a more inclusive understanding of Christ, where people of all religions are understood to be followers of Christ while seeking God in their own religious context. So people of other religions are they're seeking God in their religions, but in effect they are seeking Christ. They may not call it Christ, but they are seeking Christ within their own religions. That's what Vatican II, that's the kind of inclusivism they walk away with in Vatican II. Now, this was done by limiting the importance of how God reveals himself in the scriptures in favor of a more general revelation of how people experience God in different religions. So, again, there's that presupposition again, limiting special revelation, mending or melding it with general revelation, and you get a limited factor. You really elevate experience in there. And so they're limiting God's special revelation for their experience of God. And again, we see that presupposition, and it's going to replace any kind of divine special revelation of God through his person and his word. Now, that Paul or Hedges continues on here, and he says, beyond this, the many individuals and specific churches in dialogue with Jews seek to fight prejudice and anti-Semitism and change the way we speak about Judaism, also attests to the first forcefulness with which this awareness has come home to roost. He says, I do not wish to diminish this in any way. Yet, at the same time, many Jews have long felt uneasy in dialogue with Christians and continue to find a number of Christian approaches to Judaism insensitive or flawed in their approach. Further, I will argue strong anti Semitic vestiges remain in the way Christians speak and think. And so he's saying, even, and this is pretty normal for critical theorists, because they are so progressive, they're not liberal, they're progressive. They're going to come along and say, yes, we have in this liberal society, in this free society like America has been, we have tried to make amends. We have tried to do all these things to really dialogue with different religions and really not be so forceful in anti-Semitism as we have before. Yet that's not enough. Critical theorists are always going to say that. So, next paragraph, he says, for the purpose of this paper, I need only to outline a few ways in which the Christian tradition, from the Gospels to the ghettos, has been complicit in anti Semitism. The New Testament itself is the basis for Christian anti Semitism, for it introduces what becomes the character of the Jew, and that's in quotation marks, as an enemy of Jesus and the nascent Christian community. And so I wrote down some notes here. Let's see. I put, oh, here we go. I've been saying this from the beginning of this paper that a dismissal of scripture is the key move needed to dismiss our quote unquote Eurocentric Jesus. And that's exactly what he's doing here. He's saying that the New Testament itself is the basis for this problem of anti Semitism. So he moves on. Of course, as noted above, the contemporary notion of the racialized Jew has been drawn from elsewhere, while the biblical texts have been read within a particular context of the relationship of Jews and Christians. But the West, and that's the West, W-E-S-T apostrophe S, the West's lineage of anti-Semitism resulting in the Holocaust is inconceivable without its foundations in Christianity. And I have to pause there real quick. The West lineage of anti-Semitism resulting in the Holocaust is inconceivable without its foundations in Christianity. I mean, is that really inconceivable? Is something so awful and tragic inconceivable outside of Christianity? I mean, it's pretty well documented that Hitler was not a Christian. He was an atheist. He was actually infatuated with the readings of Friedrich Nietzsche. And so, the ideas of the final solution, the ideas of complete genocide. I don't know if it's a fair assessment to say that anti-Semitism coming out of a Christian foundation is what's resulting in the Holocaust. That just seems pretty far-fetched. Even though there were many, and I understand there were many Christians, many church leaders who approved of the Nazi Party, and that's very unfortunate. But at the same time, there were also many Christians who were trying to stop it, who were risking their lives to really execute Hitler, to assassinate him. So is this I don't think this is a fair assessment. I think this is hyperbole. This is another technique. It's a rhetorical technique used by these critical theorists to kind of drive your emotions to see things their way, and they don't make, really valid arguments that are backed up with research, and I'm going to show that here in just a minute. They're going to play to your emotions, get you to see something one way, and really exploit the cracks in your thinking to try to get you to their way of thinking. So, Hedges continues here from among various possible passages, three have often been important. He's talking about passages in scripture. He uses Matthew 27:25, says his blood will be on us, and that's the Jews, and on our children. John 8:44 says, you Jews are from your father, the devil. And then John 20:19, the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. All right. So he uses those three examples in the New Testament to talk about anti Semitism towards the Jews in the New Testament. And he says, read by later Christians, distanced from the Jewish roots of Jesus and the gospel authors, these have signified a charge of decide a pernicious relationship with Satan and an antagonism with Christians. This was crystallized in the work of theologians such as John Chrysostom, who wrote in scathing terms, you will learn that they, the Jews, are abominable and lawless and murderous and enemies of God. I shall first demonstrate that even if they have not been deprived of their ancestral way of life, this is John Chrysostom, by the way, even so, their fast would be polluted and impure. And I shall demonstrate that not only the fast, but also the other practices which they observe, sacrifices and purifications and festivals, are also abominable. Now, here's what's interesting about what Hedges is doing here. And anyone who has ever done any kind of theology knows this is a no-no. He is doing what we call eisegesis. He is taking certain texts and he is reading into them what he wants to get out of them. He is handpicking certain texts that kind of make his point. That, of course, they say bad things about the Jews, but they're completely taken out of context, and then they are used to try to prove his point. He's not he is not really doing what we would call exegesis, looking at the text and trying to use the context of the surrounding verse to explain what that verse means. No, he is inserting his own meaning into the text. And this is just it's bad scholarship. We don't do this with other books. I mean, actually we do. Critical theorists do this with books all the time. You can read, I mean, this is why this really started in literature. Some of it started in law, but um, a lot of this critical theory survives in literature, reading in English departments, because you can use any kind of text and make it say whatever you want under critical theory, and that's what they do. And so he's not doing good exegesis here. He's committing a no in how he interprets the Bible. And so let's see what goes on. So this is Hedges continuing. Meanwhile, Saul's midrash on Jesus and the law became a way to contrast Christian freedom from the dead law of Judaism, a trope played upon by such figures as Justin Martyr and Tertullian. So again, there's this idea, and this is something that in seminary I had to talk about and write about. So this is, to his credit, this is an important topic that must be addressed. But the idea is that um, Christian freedom in Christ, life in Christ, is really juxtaposed to the dead law of Judaism. And yes, that's a simplistic way of saying it, and it does happen. But I'm going to tell you right now, even in conservative scholarship, you don't get away with that. That's not how it works. Even the most conservative biblical scholars today, the ones who truly believe in Jesus's messiahship, they believe that the law has worth because Paul talks about the law, especially in Romans, having worth. And so, he wouldn't know his sin if he did not have the law. So again, he's Hedges here is setting up this kind of false dilemma, this false juxtaposition. It's not really there. It's meant to sound like a good argument, but it's really meant to play against your emotions again. Let's see. He continues. However, for the Western tradition, Augustine stands as the key figure in determining how Jews would be viewed. He argued that the Jews should be left as a destitute and denigrated people as a sign to everyone of the fate of those who turn away from Christ. Now, here's where I have a problem with Hedges big time. That is a pretty substantial claim that Augustine is the key historical figure in how Western Christianity is to view Judaism. And he does not, Hedges, that is, he does not cite a single source. And we'll talk about this a little more. There is no working with Augustine's sources here. There's no citing any kind of secondary source that is talking about Augustine. This is just an assertion. This is a conjecture. This is something he's saying, but he's not backing it up with any kind of information. Now you can do that if you want in papers, but then you have to follow it with evidence that makes your claim. Unfortunately, he doesn't do that. And so we'll continue. Through the medieval and early modern period, Christian anti-Semitism saw the blood libel allegation instituted. I'm not sure what that means right there, so I don't know how to explain that. The blood libel allegation instituted, in which many Jews were slaughtered in the belief that they sacrificed Christian children for their own rituals. Now that's a pretty big claim that there were Christians out there slaughtering Jews because they believed Jews were sacrificing children. Again, no citation, no historic record, nothing. Hedges continues. They were also accused of causing the Black Death, no citation, and as those in effect given the role of money lenders. Christians were forbidden from usury. Again, no citation. Hatred as rich Jews, though most remained in poverty. So, most remained in poverty. Let's see. In time, the ghetto was instituted, and while at first it was a somewhat pragmatic, even arguably not unbeneficial arrangement for Jews, it became, certainly within the papal states, an embodied material manifestation of an Augustinian theology of the Jews, in which the Jews were kept denigrated and degraded. Again, no citation, not working with Augustine anywhere, not citing his sources, not citing any kind of historical document, not citing any secondary source who is citing those sources. It's just a plain assertion. And so my note here that I was taking down when I was doing this was, I said, where's the proof? This becomes a question of proper scholarship. Hedges offers no citations of the writings of Augustine or any theologian influence to think like Augustine. He makes a base accusation that seems to be centered more around emotional response and wants his readers to take his writing for granted. However, in normal academic scholarship, if a writer is making a contested claim like Hedges is doing here, then it is customary and expected that he would cite sources for these arguments. And he simply doesn't do that. And so as an academic person myself, this infuriates me, because if you're going to make claims about a theologian, then you need to interact with his sources. Now, I read a book a few months back talking about egalitarian theology in the church today. It was written about 20 years ago. I'm a complementarian myself. That's neither here or there, but that's the idea that men and women, while they're equal in dignity and worth, they have different roles and responsibilities. within the church and the home. I was reading a book by a well-respected theologian, and she was writing about egalitarianism, and she talked about Augustine, about his anti-egalitarian views. And you know what she did? She actually worked with Augustine's sources. She went through them and she tested them, and she, questioned them, and she argued against them. That's great. That's what you're supposed to do in academia to make your point. You are supposed to work with the sources and you're supposed to argue about them. Hedges doesn't do any of that here. There's nothing like this. It is all pure conjecture. And I tell you what, if I was writing a paper like this and I was being graded on it at the graduate level, I would get shot down because this would not be accepted. So Hedges continues, a study of Christian anti-Semitism would not be complete without considering Luther. We all know, if we know anything about Luther, we know this is coming, whose views changed from an arguably benign belief that his reform would bring Jews to Christianity into deeply virulent anti-Semitism. He asserted that Jews were the children of the devil who accused God of lying and proudly despise the whole world, and whose schools are nothing but the devil's nest. Now, Luther's anti Semitism is well documented, and it is known by most people who have dabbled in any kind of Reformed theology. And so it is a sad occurrence. I don't want to walk away from this and say Luther didn't sin. He most assuredly did sin. The things that he wrote unlovingly, they're not right. There's a problem there. But where a normal theologian, an Orthodox theologian would say, hey, there's a lot of other things that Luther wrote that were good, that were beneficial. We need to hang on to those while cutting out the bad, the fat, the awful stuff. What Hedges is going to argue here is that actually we need to cut off everything. We need to get rid of all of Luther. We need to get rid of all of Western theology, because these two people, and he gives some citations for Luther. One of the books by Luther is called "The Jews and Their Lies," so it's pretty well known. If you have any inclination towards theology and you want to look into that, but he gives no sources for Augustine. So we're supposed to throw out theology based on what Augustine and Luther have said, yet he really didn't tell us anything about what Augustine said. So this is really, this is troubling. This is not a good thing. We can't have scholars who act like they have a knowledge of a subject and then not work with the sources at all when they're going to make a point about them. And so he's got a long quote of Luther in here. I'm not going to read it. It is anti-Semitic. I don't need to tell you it's from the book The Jews and Their Lies. I don't need to read it. I will grant Hedges that point, that there is anti-Semitism in there. However, I'm arguing against something else. Do we need to throw out the whole of Christology over the last 2,000 years in order to correct this? I would say no. Hedges says yes. Hedges continues, with this noted, we may observe that there is simply no doubt that the four main strands of Christianity today, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and Pentecostal, have inherited a legacy that is dripping. I love that word, that adjective there. That is dripping with anti-Semitic sentiment. It may even be stated that the blood of the Lamb that is meant to save Christians can be identified with the blood of Jews who have paid the price for how Christians have envisaged their salvation. So yeah, hyperbole much there, Hedges. Yeah, that is a lot. He is really swinging for the fences and really trying to get you with his rhetoric right here. So 4 Christians have killed Jews in crusades and in the Holocaust with vengeance. That most mainstream churches today have repented of such involvement, and that many Christians sought to save Jews during the Holocaust, and even that churches and Christians are often at the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism and in anti-racism campaigns, does not assuage the institutional, cultural, structural, than systematic anti-Semitism of the tradition. There it is. I've been telling you that since the beginning. This is not just not a small local problem. This is not just a problem of a few pages in theology that we need to remember and push to the side. No, this is indicative of the entire system. And he says, if we cannot simply be non-racist, or he says, we cannot simply be non-racist, but must be anti-racist, then it is arguably the case that more work is to be done. This is how all these critical theorists work in any field. It doesn't matter if it's law, if it's theology, if it's philosophy. If there is any kind of idea that resembles any kind of racism from the past, then it has to be entirely gutted. We have to get rid of it entirely. That is what anti-racism is. It's not non-racism, it's anti-racism and deconstructing the entire system and getting rid of it. So the idea here is that all of theology, Western theology, not any other theology, not any other kind of non-white theology, only Eurocentric North American theology of the last 2,000 years, it sits on the chopping block of the ethic of anti-Semitism, which is in Hedge's argument, anti-race. It needs to be viewed under an anti-racist scope. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Let's see here. Oh, yeah, actually, I'm not going to skip ahead. Some may respond that churches and theologians have already responded strongly, but these responses are often inadequate, sometimes woefully so. Again, whatever they're doing is not good enough. Space does not permit a full survey of the relevant literature, so I will note only a few representatives. Let's see, we'll skip ahead. However, as recent studies have shown, incidents of Christians saving Jews was not in and of itself evidence of lack of anti-Semitism. A negative evaluation of Jews and Judaism cannot coexist with a humanitarian hand of rescue. And so what he's saying there is he's saying that a lot of work, and I skipped over a lot of this paragraph, but a lot of work has been done to show how Christians were at the forefront of saving Jews during the Holocaust, hiding them. And what Hedges is arguing, and he actually cites a source here, go figure, he's citing one of his own buddies because the book in which he's citing this essay out of, the book is titled Anti-Semitism, Christian Ambivalence, and the Holocaust. So obviously that's going to be someone who supports, the way he thinks. And he's saying, however, even though these Christians were at the forefront of hiding Jews, of helping them escape the terrors of the Holocaust, he's saying that recent studies of the people that he is only reading, he's not reading anybody else. He's not looking at the literature of anybody else. I've already proven that because he refuses to cite Augustine. He's not looking at, some of these older theologians. He's only looking at the ones that clearly have made some missteps and anti-Semitic remarks. He's only looking towards scholarship that proves his point. And so he says, recent studies have shown incidents of Christians saving Jews was not in and of itself evidence of lack of anti-Semitism. So he's saying that those Christians who were saving the Jews in the Holocaust, that wasn't anti-Semitism. It was really just, they were just trying to be nice. They're trying to do the right thing. They're not really fighting anti-Semitism. And what he's saying is that you can't have humanitarian aid. You can't do nice things. You can't protect people. Really, you can't protect the image of God and also dislike a people, like the Jews. And I would agree with that to some extent. I think he is undercutting the good deeds of a lot of people in the past who really tried and truly loved people and wanted to protect them and wanted to do the right thing because their religion commands them to. So I think that's a bit of a disingenuous thing for him to say. He's really coming from this idea that because Christian theology is historically anti-Semitic, and he's only shown us like 2 quotes to prove that, and 3 Bible verses taken out of context. That's the history of theology for him. 3 Bible verses and 2 quotes, because the history of Western Christianity is anti-Semitic, then Christians in Germany and the surrounding countries during the Holocaust that, hid Jews, they weren't really anti-Semitic. They weren't really genuine. They were just doing a humanitarian thing. I don't buy that. I think that's a baseless, just a terrible argument. How can you know that? How can you quantify that? How can you get into the heads of the people that were doing that? You can't. That is unless you have journal entries from people back then and say, I really I hated the Jews at the time, but I had to hide them anyways. Unless you have something like that and you have an abundance of evidence, I don't think you can really make that kind of argument. It's just pure conjecture. So let's see. Let's continue on. Let's see here. See, in the next paragraph, he's saying, let's see. In other words, one strong line in Christian apologetic response in what we may term post-Holocaust theology has been to argue that the correct answer for Christians is to more fully recognize the implications of their theology of love and grace in a way that undercuts, diminishes, or subverts anti Semitism by showing that such a response is not a full realization of Christian teaching. That is, our theology is not wrong. We just haven't manifested it correctly. So, this is at the end of a long paragraph where he actually cites a lot of his buddies, a lot of other critical scholars, talking about how, you know, there's this idea that their post Holocaust theology would say that, the Christian ideal isn't wrong. It's just that we haven't fully manifested or realized this theology. We are sinners, so we have problems, and so he's arguing that that's just not the case. That's not how this works. Your theology is completely off, and it needs to be deconstructed. I wrote a note here. It said this was the response that most rational people would adopt, that Luther sinned, but that does not mean that we throw out his entire theological tradition. The scriptures, which it seems Hedges denies has any real authority or importance for the Christian religion, never expects perfection from its participants. And that is why we have continual confession and repentance of sin. And so, yeah, this idea that, you know, we have to be somehow perfect kind of comes out in this theology that Hedges is espousing here. Again, we don't see that in the biblical text. So we see a call to be perfect, like Christ is perfect, understanding that we will never attain that mark. But at the same time, I think what Hedges is holding people up to is just really it's unfair, and people just cannot get to that point that where he wants them to be. Let's see. Let's see. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So, see in the last paragraph of this section, Hedges is talking about what he's going to do next, and he says, "In this next section, I will make a final note on Christendom, as Jacob Neusner, I don't know who that is, has convincingly argued the theological um, diminution of discredit or the theological discrediting of Judaism that occurred was not simply an aberration in the realm of ideas, but was intimately linked with Christianity's victory in converting the Roman Empire to its side and hence winning its contestation with Judaism." So, what he's saying here is that there's this idea that um, the theological discrediting of Judaism had more to do with Christianity's converting the Roman Empire and pushing out the Jews rather than being the right idea and growing on its own merit. He continues, the fact that Jesus was Messiah was clearly proved now that those once persecuted had emerged to conquer the persecutors. Historically, this is linked to the creation of what becomes Orthodox Christology and the councils beginning under Constantine at Nicaea. The cradle of Christology in empire is also the negation of any link with Judaism when finally a clear break between the two traditions emerged. Christology is part and parcel of Jesus' Jewishness denied. And so what he's saying there is that Christian theology won out because it won Rome. Rome then turned around and persecuted the Jews, and to really, cement itself away from the Jewish context of Jesus's ministry. Christianity at the time of Constantine and Nicaea really started making up a new Christology, this idea of what we have as Orthodox Christology today. And it really separated itself from the Jewish roots of Jesus's time. And so my note here says that we're coming closer to the true intentions of Hedges' work. Early Christianity had to win a war against Judaism and, in essence, allied itself with the Roman Empire for the persecution and oppression of Judaism, which allowed Christianity to win this religious war. Therefore, as Hedges would contend, our Western Christology is completely wrong because at the heart of it is not exposition of the scriptures revealed to be the word of God, but anti-Semitism. All right. And I don't even know if he would argue that we can even get a correct view of Jesus from the scriptures because he's clearly not a fan of the scriptures. And so what I said, I wrote kind of an angry note there. What a bunch of garbage. This is how people like Hedges think. In essence, Hedges really hates Orthodox Christianity. He's not going to say that here in this article, but make no doubt he hates it at the heart of it. He is going to use this kind of argument to really gut it out. And so what he is doing is that he is discrediting early Orthodox beliefs about Jesus because of anti-Semitism, which he has established earlier is a form of racism, which it was in this section we didn't cover because it didn't talk directly about theology. And so we come to the next section of the paper: White Jesus, Jewish Jesus, post-Holocaust Christologies, and a Jewish prophet. So let's see here. I'm not want to read all of this. I'm going to read the first paragraph and we'll see where we go from there. I don't want to read everything here because there's just still so much that we can get to. From theological tomes and popular culture, it has increasingly been recognized that portraying Jesus as white does not do justice to first century Palestinian context of the historical figure known as Jesus of Nazareth. I would agree with that. Moreover, in enculturation around the world, Jesus has been portrayed as being racially Chinese, African, Indian, and more. With such a framing, it may be argued that a blonde, blue eyed Jesus is nothing more than particularly parochial Northwestern European framing of this figure as another act of enculturation. So he's saying it may be argued that, this is just how European, North American people see Jesus. He's a blonde haired, blue eyed kind of Jesus, whereas people in other cultures see Jesus like themselves. However, he moves on. There is something to be said for this. Why should not Swedes imagine Jesus as one of them, much as Nigerians imagine Jesus as one of them, and Koreans the same? Let's see. And then, okay, so he keeps saying, he keeps making the same examples with just different ethnicities. And the next paragraph: however, the global norms of Northwestern Europe and the United States have become, as noted above, hegemonic global norms. White Jesus is not simply the Jesus of a certain branch of the Caucasian peoples of the northwestern end of the Eurasian landmass, but the image transported globally and enforced in conversion by the cross and the sword. So there's some more hyperbole. We don't have any sources cited, which is pretty common for Hedges. He only cites sources that he agrees with. He's not citing any kind of historical text here, such that one would not be surprised in entering a church in Argentina or Angola, Singapore, or I don't even know how to say that, to catch sight of a white Jesus. So, should note, this is all conjecture. Hedges offers no citations. He's making his argument. He's using rhetoric to do it. He's really trying to drum up your emotions. He's not making a good argument. There's no kind of scholarship going on here. So let's see, what does he say? Going down a little further in the paragraph. Indeed, one could imagine that it would not be too hard, even today, to complete an undergraduate degree or seminary training without ever once explicitly reading or being told that Jesus was actually Jewish, or realizing that theology exists outside a Western tradition. I've got a note here. I'm going to hammer him here. This is completely false. I've been a student at two conservative evangelical seminaries that have no love for the kind of theology that Hedges is espousing here. And they hold to traditional Orthodox teaching that would largely be considered part of the Western tradition that Hedges is talking about. Yet, both of these seminaries, especially in taking New Testament studies, and I took them at both seminaries. When I took New Testament studies, they talked a lot about the Jewishness of Jesus and made sure the students were aware of these arguments and these trends in New Testament scholarship, especially about post Holocaust New Testament studies. This was something that was in seminary. All right. And Hedges' article is not, it's from 2 years ago. So it's not like this is something that's going back 30 or 40 years. This is something that's relatively recent, and this is absolutely false. He makes a citation here of, let's see, about one of his own books called Understanding Religion, talking about chapter 7. However, he doesn't cite any other sources that says seminaries don't teach Jewish context of Jesus. And that's just simply not true. So what I have to say here is that Hedges, you're an absolute liar. And this is a baseless accusation. You're painting Christians with Orthodox beliefs as a kind of dumb fundamentalists who know nothing about the theological world outside their own bubble. And this is absolutely false. In fact, in my own experience, I tend to think we spent too much time talking about the contextual Jewishness of Jesus and not enough time explaining what he was teaching and how we make sense of the New Testament as a cohesive literary unit. I thought we spent a lot of time on Jewish culture and the context. And so I think this is a baseless claim. I'm calling him out. If he wants to respond to me on that, fine. I'll challenge him on it. Makes no difference to me. And so he is setting himself up here. So Hedges is setting himself up here. For the remainder of this paper, I will turn to address steps ahead toward a decolonized Christology. So a non-Eurocentric Christology that takes on board the anti-Semitic legacy within the wider frames noted. To speak only of a Jewish Jesus without considering the wider structural frames of anti-Semitism would not be truly anti-racist. Okay, so it's not enough that we just talk about Jewish Jesus, which I just said was what the seminaries are actually doing. He said, well, it's almost like he's backing off of his argument here. He's like, well, yeah, the seminaries are actually talking about it, but that's not enough. That's not enough to be actually anti-racist. He says, I seek to go beyond. He says Ruther's answer. Ruther is a scholar, another theorist he's talking about, because it's not as simply enough to redefine a theological formula in Christology to erase Christian anti-Semitism. Let's see. A move towards an anti-Semitic Christology demands, I would suggest, and this is Hedges here, a move beyond liberal assumptions that we can naively get to a point where we simply think better or act better without taking account of how anti-racism has educated us about the much wider structural features in the culture of the diminishment of Jews in which Christianity is embedded. There it is. I've been saying we're moving to this point the entire time. This is where he comes out and says it. These are not just liberal. It's not enough to have liberal assumptions. We have to move beyond this. We can't just think better and act better. We have to understand the entire structural problems and how we've been educated about Christ and how that's embedded in our anti-Semitism. And so, for those of you who do not know, And I hear people say this all the time. They talk about, critical theory, critical race theory, decolonialization, post-colonialism, all this being liberal. And I have friends who get into politics that'll say that. And I'm telling you, this is not liberal. They are not liberals. They are progressives. Liberals generally like freedom. So if we think of it in terms of like critical race theory, Martin Luther King Jr., he was a liberal. He wanted a continual betterment. He wanted us to act better. He wanted us to think better. He wanted us to move towards something better. Critical race theorists, and you can look at their literature. You can buy the book, Critical Race Theory, an introduction by Richard Delgado. And it says on like the third page, they deny the liberal movement towards racism. They don't think that's how it should happen. They need to establish anti-racism, which is a complete overhaul of the system. And that is what Hedges is doing here with theology. He's saying we have to have anti-racism in theology. We have to completely tear down the structure. So know one thing, when you're talking about people who think like this, they're not technically liberals, they're progressives. All right. There is a lot that goes into it, but critical theories, they completely deny the liberal idea of continually getting better. Critical theorists will always say that liberalism can never do enough, so we must completely overhaul the system. Hedges continues in the next paragraph. Not only was Jesus Jewish, but his thought world and cultural framing were those of an observant Jew, as can be learned from scholars. Let's see, Jesus' worldview seriously means to recognize there. I want to skip some of this because he's talking about certain scholars that he's quoting. Let's see. This means to recognize that there is no way that Jesus could have imagined himself as being equal to God, nor could this have been expressed in such a way to the people around him. So what he's saying is that there are certain scholars out there that are studying the Jewishness of Jesus, and they're saying there is no serious means to recognize that there is any way Jesus could have imagined himself as God, as equal to God. And so he moves on. Careful scholars of the historical Jesus have, taking full note of this, sought ways to reconcile Christian conceptions of this. Let's see. But it is too easy for Christians to imagine Jesus as somehow not like other Jews, to see him in opposition of the Jews as the founder of their religion, and to absorb the false gospel claims that Jewish people and their leaders were responsible for Jesus' death. So the Jews didn't put Jesus to death, according to Hedges here. Jesus died as a traitor to Rome, executed for treason. These are Hedges' words, not as a blasphemer under Jewish law, as Stephen, the so-called proto-martyr. So what he's telling us here is that, what you've seen, what you've read in the Gospels, it's not true. Jesus was not put to death as a heretical Jew. He was put to death as a traitor to Rome. And that really just doesn't fit, because the Jews were ones who wanted to put him to death. They couldn't because of their law. They take him to Pilate, the Roman, I can't remember his exact title. We'll say he's the Roman governor of the province there. And Pilate washes his hands, says, his blood's not on my hands. I have no reason to put this man to death, meaning he's not a traitor to Rome. Hedges is saying, nope, we're throwing that out. That is a lie. That's a false gospel. That's not how it happened. So again, it's just crazy how this works. This is an example of critical scholarship. What we know about Jesus primarily comes from the New Testaments. There are a few historical snippets about Jesus and other major historical documents from the time, but what we primarily know about Jesus is from the New Testament. And so in order to make the claims that Hedges is making here, is that we have to deny the legitimacy of the New Testament, either through reinterpretation or just flatly ignoring the entire text. So he's making some big assumptions here. And so he continues in the next paragraph, to think, or to truly think with Jesus in his Jewishness is, of course, to directly counter much of the Christian tradition. And I just wrote a little note there. And I said, is it? I think this is a false dilemma. Either we choose the true Jewish rendition of Jesus, or we choose the Western white Christian tradition of Jesus. I think there's a way that they come together, and I think this is a false dilemma that he is trying to hang us up on. So let's see. He continues. It is hard not to think of a father of the church not steeped in the adversus Judaeus tradition, which is the adversity against the Jews, but also to run against what has become defined as traditional Christology. Okay, so here we go. It is to think heretically to adopt what some may see as Judaizing, as a Judaizing trend toward what has been termed an Ebionite theology. Okay, so what's he saying here? He's saying that in order to really accept the Jewishness of Jesus, we have to get away from the traditional Christology. And he says we have to get closer to an Ebionite theology. Now, there's those of you, some of you may not know what Ebionite theology is. There's a small section I've got here from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says Ebionites believed in one God and taught that Jesus was the Messiah and was the true prophet mentioned in Deuteronomy 18:15. Yet they rejected the virgin birth of Jesus and believed Jesus became the Jewish Messiah because he followed the Jewish law, not because he was the Son of God, but because he followed the Jewish law. Now, so for those of who don't know, Ebionites were declared heretics by the early church because they denied the deity of Christ. So, according to Hedges, what he's arguing here is that because there have been instances of anti Semitism, which is equal to racism in the history of Orthodox Christian theology, we need to abandon these Western beliefs about Christ in order to embrace a theology of Christ that is closer to one that actually denies his deity. That's what he's saying here. We need to move closer to a theology that denies the deity of Christ. So, I've been telling you this from the beginning. This should not be a surprise to you. So let's see. I don't want. I want to wrap this up. I want to move on. However, it is, I would argue, thoroughly biblical. So he's saying his idea of a heretical Jesus, a non-orthodox tradition, the Ebionite tradition of Jesus, is thoroughly biblical. So it's really weird. In certain instances, he really upholds the scriptures, and others he questions them and says they are to blame for anti-Semitism in our culture. Make of that what you want. It's kind of confusing. I think he wants to intentionally confuse us that way, maybe. So we'll see here. But he says, however, it is, I would argue, thoroughly biblical. I do not think it is problematic to assert that what is generally considered the earliest of the Gospels, that of Mark, teaches an adoptionist low Christology. What that means is that Mark, being the first gospel, he believes Mark teaches what is called adoptionist doctrine of Christ. Adoptionist being that Christ became Messiah at some time in his ministry because he followed the law of God. Ebionite theology or Ebionite theology is adoptionist in a sense. And so he says, while in Acts, it plainly states, if one adopts a plain meaning of the text hermeneutic, that Jesus was a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him. And he's quoting Acts 20 or 2:22. And so my note here says Hedges is picking his verses and attempting to make an entire theology of adoptionism, which is that Jesus became God by being adopted as the Son of God at his baptism. This is completely out of context with the rest of Peter's sermon in Acts 2 and makes the case that the rest of Peter's sermon makes the case that Jesus is God incarnate and that the Jews crucified him and they denied him and they repented of it. And so Hedges is really he's very carefully picking what he wants and trying to make a case. And if you take it in context, it doesn't work. And that's what eisegesis does. He's trying to make a whole theology out of a few words, and you just can't do that. So let's see. Let's skipping ahead. I would argue that to think a high Christology, to think in Orthodox Trinitarian forms about Jesus as affirmed in the Nicene Chalcedonian tradition. So Nicaea, the one that really identifies, um, the Trinity, identifies the three persons of the Trinity. That's the council that identifies the three persons of the Trinity. The Council of Chalcedon identifies the nature and makes clear what the person and work is of Christ, identifies Jesus' nature and his person and how all of that works. So what he's saying is, he says, I would argue that to think a high Christology, to think in Orthodox Trinitarian forms about Jesus as affirmed in the Nicene Chalcedonian tradition, is to be implicated within the anti-Semitism of the authors and lineage that developed them. So if you think about Jesus in these Trinitarian firms, you are implicated in anti-Semitism. As I noted above, this is Hedges. As I noted above, these councils and debates came within a context that explicitly sought to divide Christianity's root and branch from its Jewish heritage as a triumphalist agenda of imperial Christianity. And so, as I have said all along, to embrace Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity is to take part in the anti Semitism Hedges is claiming. This is a complete subversion of Orthodox theology. Not only this, but the idea of subverting orthodoxy fits perfectly with one of my presuppositions of critical theory engaging in theology, which I said a couple episodes ago, is that it misunderstands who Jesus is by denying his deity. There's overwhelming proof here by Hedges himself that he wants to deny the deity of Christ, because deity of Christ is, in the words of Hedges, tied to Trinitarian theology and is anti-Semitic. So we're seeing a total upheaval of the context of the Orthodox tradition. Now let's see. I'm not gonna read the next few paragraphs because he dives deeper into some actual scholarship of people that he reads. These are all people who are going to approve of his thesis. There's no one there that's really attempting to dissuade him or argue against him. And so these are people who entirely agree with him, and they're trying to make a case about historical anti-Semitism. I would encourage you to read the paper if you want to get into them. So, but what he says, after citing these other sources of secondary sources, not primary sources, secondary sources that claim anti-Semitism. Therefore, within this context, I would argue that taking Jesus's Jewishness seriously entails seeing him as a Jewish prophet. That is how he would have understood himself and how his disciples would have understood him. Even if some scholars, for example, N.T. Wright and J.G. Dunn, and those are actually conservative scholars, even if some scholars, one wishes to argue that Jesus saw himself as the Messiah, it must still be acknowledged that within the Jewish context, this in no way signaled divinity. So again, here we go. I don't I don't think there is I don't think there's any argument that there are definite portions of the gospel where the disciples see Jesus as a prophet. I think that's pretty clear. Especially throughout Mark, they're really not sure who Jesus is until we get to a certain point, and that happens in Matthew 16 and Mark 8, where Jesus asks his disciples about his identity, about who they think he is, and Peter states that Jesus is the Holy One of God. And so you kind of have to argue, what does that mean? Is this just this cultural Messiah, as Hedges would claim, or is this the Son of God? And so, what is interesting about these sections of scripture is that the disciples relate that some people say Jesus was a prophet, like Elijah, or he was Elijah. But Peter's response, saying that he's the Holy One of God, it gives evidence that both Jesus and the disciples believed Jesus was something beyond just a prophet. He was something beyond Elijah. Even if the disciples had just recently come to adopt this belief about Jesus, they believed that he was something beyond that. And so, because of this, I find Hedges' view lacking, that Jesus is just a Jewish prophet. I don't think we get that out of the scriptures. But again, the way that Hedges interacts with the scriptures, he could just pick out those verses and deny them and be critical of them and pick ones that are more to his advantage. So moving on, we're getting to the end. We're on page 19 out of 20, almost to the end here. An obvious counter to my arguments is that it is possible to adopt a high Christology and to be anti Semitic. Certainly, as noted, many Christians have taken the problems of their tradition on board, yet have not rejected a Trinitarian formula or Jesus' divinity. Nor again do most Jews ask that Christians give up their beliefs about Jesus to become anti-Semitic. However, my concern is with deeper structures that have hidden Jesus' Jewishness and have been complicit in implicit or explicit anti-Semitic prejudice. In these terms, we may become personally anti-racist, but forget the structural and cultural prejudice which resides within our system. So again, again, it's not about your personal beliefs. And if you any kind of critical theory you're doing out there, critical race theory, post-colonialism, any of this stuff out there within the political realm, within the cultural realm, within the theological realm, it's not about your personal beliefs. And this gets so many people hung up because, when these racist problems were happening in America over the last few years, and people were, you'd have people who were conservative saying, I'm not racist. I don't understand. It's not about your personal beliefs. It's about the entire systematic cultural structure being upturned, uprooted, deconstructed, and made into something different. That is what Hedges is talking about here with Western theology. That's what he wants. And so stop thinking that this is just a personal problem. It's not. This is not what they're getting at, because ultimately what people like Hedges are going to say is it's just not enough for you to think this way, to think that we need to get better. We have to completely uproot the system, which means we have to get rid of the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus. So let's see the last part here. Let's see. Oh, the very last sentence, but to realize that we must act in the realization of a messianic ideal as an ethical imperative, as a Messiah, seen an anointed one as a person whose ethical imperative is to act righteously. Okay, let me go back there for a minute. Let me. So I just finished off with it's not enough just to go over that phrase. We really need to get a context here. So let me backtrack a little. A high Christology separates Jesus from his Jewishness, is filled with the content of a history of white Jesus ideology and imperial triumphalism, and is embedded in texts that make Christians all too readily stand in opposition to Jews. We must, I argue, think Jesus apart from Christianity. So we have to think about Jesus apart from Christianity. Does one stand with the persecuted prophet from Galilee on his own terms, or with those who denigrated his people, denied humanity to an entire group of humans, and embedded genocidal hatred in this world? Again, there's that hyperbole again. He's really tugging at your emotions there. Indeed, as noted above, to take the Jewish notion of Messiah seriously as one anointed is not all of us who must be the agents of God's word, proclaiming and telling as that we must devote ourselves to the world. It's a confusing sentence there. Okay. Not to vainly proclaim ourselves as Messiah, but to recognize that we must act in the realization of a messianic ideal as an ethical imperative. And so what he's saying here is that we cannot view Jesus as divine Messiah. We need to separate Jesus from Christianity. We need to understand his Jewishness, and what that is a messianic ideal, an ethical imperative to act, ethically towards other people. And my note here is, and as with all of these critical theories, it all comes back to ethics, which we could say is a problem of misunderstanding human nature. And that's another presupposition. that I have claimed it's common among critical theorists. It all gets back to how we treat people here and now. Oppressors oppressed. We have this very horizontal view of sin. Jesus doesn't act as the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world as an atoning sacrifice for my sin and your sin. No, he acts as a messianic ideal and as an ethical imperative on how we treat people in power relationships. And that's what it really boils down to for Hedges. So, getting into the last section, toward a decolonized anti-racist Christology. As we'll be seeing, this is not really an argument about whether Jesus had olive, brown, or other skin complexion. Indeed, like pulling down statues of slavers to discuss Jesus' skin tone is not to participate in a relatively, or is to participate in a relatively superficial level of anti-racism. The structures and culture of prejudice will not be changed by toppling some bronze statues or by changing some dark-skinned Jesuses on the walls. Therefore, I have here argued that to be truly anti-racist in our theologies, we need to first reflect on the racialization of Christianity's long complicity with such prejudicial systems and go back to the root, the marginalization of Jesus's own Jewishness, and with it a legacy that has pitted Jews against Christians. Of course, this is not to suggest that Christians should adopt contemporary Jewish modes of being, but they should reflect within their own tradition on the ways in which this anti-Semitism may be countered. Indeed, it is in part to take seriously Christian relations with those identified as being other than Christians, and to do this within a worldview that is opposed to racial domination. Here we go. I have argued that this takes us to Christology. So the way that we get rid of this is by going to the doctrine of Christ, all right, which itself needs to be rethought from its base in Christian theology, is to be decolonized and become anti-racist. It is a call that will be seen by many as heretical. Yes, it is very heretical. It will challenge the ecclesial structures to their very foundations. Yeah, I mean, this is what I've been saying the entire time. He wants to uproot everything we hold dear. And if they are wrong about this, what else may they be wrong about? He's talking about Christians. If Christians are wrong about their Christology, what else may they be wrong about? He's just trying to deconstruct the center of what we believe in. This does not mean that we can re-enter an original Jewish Christianity or early Jesus movement position. We can't. It's not enough to talk about the Jewishness of Jesus, for we cannot know that Jesus has. So, what he's saying here, it's not enough for us to know about the early Jewishness of Jesus. And then he ends with, we cannot know what Jesus or his earlier followers actually thought. Oh, really? We can't know what they thought. So it's almost like Hedges is claiming that he has some kind of esoteric knowledge, some kind of secret knowledge that he understands early Jewish Jesus, but we don't. And it's not enough for us to go back and try to understand, Jewish Christianity or any kind of early Jesus movement position. No, we have to completely, our only option is to separate Christ from our Christian doctrine. That's just, it's like that's a cheap argument. Let's see, last paragraph. Nevertheless, if we take his legacy, the Jesus, as one that opposes anti-Semitism and racism, then we need to seriously consider his context and our context for thinking Christology today. This, I have argued, means renouncing much that stands for traditional Orthodox Christological construction and to take on ourselves not a messianic role, but a role as partners in bringing about an anti-racist messianic ideal as those anointed to act righteously before the other. So what he's saying here is that if we're going to think about Jesus the right way, we can't get back to how he and his earlier, or how his early followers actually thought. We can't get back to that. That's lost to history. We can't rely on the scriptures, although he uses the scriptures numerous of times to try to make his point. In order to understand the actual messianic role of Jesus is to understand his anti-racist messianic ideal. And so that's and how we act ethically towards other people. So if that's not like seeing Jesus in yourself, if that's not like what we talk about in theology all the time, that a lot of people imagine Jesus and they look in the mirror and that's who they see. They don't see themselves, they see Jesus, but really they see themselves. If that's not committing the same fallacy here, that the way to think about Jesus the correct way is to really uphold my own anti-racist messianic ideal, then I don't know what is. So this is very self-serving for Hedges. This is really himself trying to pat himself on the back and people who think like him. So that is the end of the article. I have had enough of reading Dr. Hedges' article. Obviously, I don't agree with much of what he said. I do want to try to be fair to what he said. But again, this is how the point of going through an article like this, something that was peer reviewed, something that went to a semi-academic journal. Um, this is the point of showing this, is to show you how theologians who involve themselves in critical theory, how they think, and how far away it gets from actual Orthodox Christianity. And so if you are dealing with people who think, oh, we can really adopt, critical theory and use it beneficially in theology, no, you can't, because the goal of it is to deconstruct Orthodox Christianity. It is not an evaluative tool where we can use it to try to get better. It is something that says, because you have committed a certain sin, you have to throw everything out that you believe in. And that's insane. That's crazy. That is not what we are called to do in the scriptures. That is not what Christ calls us to do. And so my point in doing all this, I want to be done talking about critical theory for a long time now. I'm sick of talking about it, but I know that a lot of people still have questions about it, and especially how it interacts with theology, because theology is kind of my main thing. I wanted to show how critical theory interacts with theology. I believe I've done that. Obviously, there's a lot more out there that I could read. There are a lot of other articles, but this one really cuts at the heart of Orthodox Christianity by using critical theory. I think it's a good example of what I was trying to show. So, if you've made it to this point in the podcast, thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. I hope that God blesses you, that the Spirit illuminates you with knowledge, that you are trying to work out your faith by better understanding it and using your rational faculties to do that. So, God bless you if you've listened to this. Please like and to subscribe and give me a good review. And I will talk to you next week. Thank you.